What's going on, guys? Dr. Andrew Fix back for another episode here on The Code. Sitting in our treatment room here inside of the gym with my buddy Shaun Cook. And you guys may have heard Shaun on a previous episode of this podcast. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but we were talking about the art and science of training in his business, Crucible Strength. So, Shaun, thanks so much for joining me in here today, buddy. I'm looking forward to get into this deadlift conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, man.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Had fun last time.
Yeah.
Although
yeah.
we went for a while. I think we're going to try to keep this one a little bit more succinct.
We will keep this conversation a little shorter. We're just on a time crunch, but important topic we're going to get into about deadlifts. And before we dive right in there, you guys, I know Shaun in a personal training capacity. He's one of the wonderful coaches here inside of this facility in DTC, Lionsden, that we work in. But Shaun, can you do our listeners just a quick favor, just sort of like reintroduce yourself, tell them a little bit, brief history of your background, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, I'll do it really quick. 21 years in the business. Been in Denver since 2011. Prior to that was in Cincinnati, Ohio as a trainer. I did a lot of personal training, but still also worked in association with Mercy Hospitals with post-orthopedic rehab, particularly when it came to lower back injuries, spinal stenosis patients and things like that. Not a physical therapist, always make that clear, but have always, which is why I think Andrew and I have a good relationship, but I've always networked closely with them. Which I think is always an important thing to do. Am currently coming back from a little bit of a knee injury from powerlifting, but currently I'm still consider myself currently an athlete for USA USA Powerlifting. Fought MMA for a few years prior to that, played football, so that's kind of my athletic background. But yeah, that's in a nutshell. Run Crucible Strength here out of my company or my business, Crucible Strength, out of the Lions Den, like Andrew said. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else to tell, really.
No, and I think that's perfect and a good segue to, we're going to talk about back pain, deadlifts, and two things that you're very familiar with, given your training history, working in that like post-orthopedic surgery kind of realm with many people that have came from a back surgery, and then you're training with them to get them back to living life. And then also powerlifting. Well, deadlift is one of the three lifts that you're doing in powerlifting. So I guess let's start there, and let's not necessarily talking about powerlifting, but let's talk about what a deadlift is, what a deadlift is not, and maybe delineate the differences mechanically between a deadlift and a squat.
Yeah.
Right. So what the heck is a deadlift?
Yeah. So a deadlift, I always joke around. The deadlift is simply the art of lifting heavy shit off the floor. And it doesn't, that's relative. It doesn't have to be heavy, but it is the delineation between the two, between the squat and the deadlift, because to your point, you see this a lot, and I see this a lot. They look very similar, but there are some key differences. So the base way for the average listener listening to this to break it down is typically a squat is going to have a much larger degree of bend at both the hip and the knee joint. And typically the load is above the waist. Not always. There are some like squat variations where you'll have the weight in like both hands and like dumbbells are below the waist. But typically you're going to see a squat, the load is above the waist. Whereas a deadlift, very typically much more hip dominant. The knee is used, but to a lesser degree, right? And typically the weight is coming from below the waist, from the floor. Okay, those are just really the simple breakdowns of the differences between the two.
Yeah, for sure. And like the way that I often like to describe it, to just put in different terms, what Shaun just said is like in the starting position or the bottom position of a deadlift in an optimal world, which there's going to be examples where we go rogue from this, but your shoulders are typically going to be in a position that is above your hips, and your hips are going to be in a position that is above your knees.
Correct.
So
in the deadlift,
in the deadlift. So from like top down, your shoulders will be above your hips will be above your knees, your hands will be on the bar or the kettlebell or whatever, the baby that you're lifting up off the floor, and we're going to drive through the floor and stand that up.
Whereas in a squat, obviously the knee and the hips can achieve the same level or the
Or-
hips actually go below the knee. Yep.
Exactly,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
So, and why I wanted to have this conversation, which, thanks for telling us like, what the deadlift is I think the deadlift is a misunderstood concept still out there in society. Like, I feel like in some ways we're kind of insulated being in here in a facility like this where we have a lot of great fitness and training minds and
Everyone's
physical therapists.
like-minded too.
Right,
Like,
yeah, we've got a lot of people that understand things similarly. And, we all do deadlifts in some way, shape, or form. And we all believe that doing deadlifts and knowing how to do them properly and doing them with regularity is a important part of a well thought out training program to make someone have the physical capabilities to do all the things that need to be able to do in their life.
Yeah.
Pick shit up off
Yeah,
the floor, like
yeah.
you said. However, I think in the medical society as a whole, in the community, in the public as a whole, I think deadlifts get a bad rap. And, I don't have to go too much farther back than about a month ago. I had a client come in that I've probably been working with for about a year. One of the things that we have accomplished over that year is got him back to some strength training,
Yeah.
including deadlifts.
Right.
And his neck pain and his back pain feels better than he has felt in a long time.
Imagine that.
So he goes back to his physician and he's talking to the physician assistant at his primary care's office. And he gets told by them that he should not be doing deadlifts, that is bad for his spine.
Even though he's feeling better.
Even though he's feeling better, and he told them that. And, they basically told him, well, we don't think you should be deadlifting. And so he comes back like, for his next appointment in our office and he tells me about that. And he's like, we're going to keep deadlifting, right? Because I feel better, I feel stronger than I have felt. So I guess coming from your training background in the post-orthopedic back surgery realm, why do you think that it is still so commonplace out in society for people to fear deadlifts, be told that they shouldn't do deadlifts? Why is that messaging still so common?
I'll put in a few levels. So probably a larger level is has nothing to do with exercise at all. It's probably the liability. So I think it's probably become easier, unfortunately, for, especially with the treatment of symptoms rather than source, stuff like that, where it just becomes easier to tell someone to avoid rather than actually make better. So I think that's key and probably the main driver, along with just ignorance. And I don't mean dumb people. We're not saying they're dumb, but there is an ignorance surrounding the deadlift and that movement among health professionals who don't do those movements themselves or don't understand the biomechanics of exactly what the movement is, what it trains, and how actually, I hate using the word bulletproof because it gets used a lot, but how essentially one can bulletproof their spine from external loads in their daily life by training it properly.
Yeah.
Right. So, that's compounded by the fact that they see, so to be fair to them, if I'm going to play the other side, to be fair to them, they're often seeing a lot of people come in who are injured from the deadlift. And the reason I'm smiling is because anytime I get someone who says I was injured in the deadlift, I have them perform what they think the deadlift is. And my joke always is, oh, the deadlift didn't injure you, whatever the hell you just did there, that's what injured you. Because oftentimes, Andrew, as you know, it's if they were doing it with the trainer or not with the trainer, it's some compound of they were improperly loading too quickly. So it's usually they just surpassed their current capacity to do the movement. So either the form was off, but even if the form was good, oftentimes we'll see, and my profession's very guilty of this as well, is I'll have other people come from other trainers who are a little iffy about doing the deadlift as well because they were just loaded way too quickly. And so it's not the movement that hurt them necessarily. It's like any movement can do that. If you're improper loading that surpasses their load capacity, it's done. And they're gonna get injured, and obviously they're not gonna want to go back to that movement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's totally true. It's like I like to operate under the premise that like no movement is like off limits, right? Even if somebody comes in, say they have back pain, and say doing a hinge or doing a deadlift does irritate them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, how can we modify that? Can we shorten the range of motion? Can we lighten the load? Can we, do something else?
Yeah.
Change the tool or the
Right.
implement we're using from a barbell to a kettlebell to a dumbbell.
Yeah.
How
Tons
can
of
we,
levers.
yeah, like
Tons of
how
levers
can
you can
we change this to still accomplish hinging and deadlifting
100%.
without the pain, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just avoiding it altogether and like the liability, like you mentioned. But I think what you brought up is so true, like the movement didn't injure us. How that movement was prepared for and
executed.
performed
Right.
is what likely injured us, or was the final straw that broke the camel's back, so
Right.
to speak. Like,
Right.
Maybe somebody tweaked their back, picking something up on a day after they had 2 straight weeks of terrible sleep.
Yeah.
Maybe they're a new parent, they've been sleeping terribly, and they're trying to deadlift like a
Right.
new PR.
Right.
That's probably not the season of your life that is the best to set that PR. If
Right.
you're getting bad sleep, maybe you're not eating appropriately, you're under a lot of stress.
Exactly.
Like all those things compile and sets the perfect storm to potentially have something go wrong if everything in your movement's not dialed in.
Do you drive your car?
I drive my car most days of the week.
Even though there's thousands of accidents a day, right?
Right.
Why? Why do you drive your car? There's thousands of accidents a day.
We gotta get.
Or could it be that, we don't do that in any other walk of life where we're like, oh man, we can't drive a car. There's tons of people, thousands a day who get injured in car accidents. Yeah, we're smart enough to know most of the times because you drive like an idiot. Those people who are getting, not always, but a majority of accidents, people performing the art of driving in an improper way. It's absolutely no different. And I'm glad you mentioned too, to back up a second too, with the deadlift is every time someone thinks about the deadlift, they're typically thinking about the barbell version. But I'm glad you said that. The deadlift, when we're talking about it, we are talking about a hinge, and there are many variations which can, to your point, you mentioned the kettlebells, can be done in a variety of different implements and stuff like that. And then that's the main thing with us, is not to become so romantic about, and I do know trainers who are, and shoot, even as a power lifter, I don't, but I've gotten further and further away from romanticizing the barbell deadlift so much to where I'm just like, this has to be the only version that we use, because it's just doesn't, it's not true.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be the only version that we use.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you can accomplish the same thing many different ways. Yeah, and back to the driving part, like, I don't want to live my life, or probably anyone listening to this conversation, like, we don't want to live our life off of the idea of something might happen. Right. I'm not going to avoid deadlifting because I might hurt my back.
Right.
Because I've done thousands of more reps of deadlifts where I did not hurt my back. Right. And I've driven my car many more times where I did not get in an accident than when I did get in an accident.
Well, we should be asking, what's the best practice?
Yeah.
Best practice is any human being should be able to hinge and pick up something without their back going like that. Like if you do and your back goes out there, that should be telling you there's something, like there's a capacity issue. There's you're deficient in some sort of movement. Yeah. And therefore the solution is typically that movement.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I'm glad you brought that up, because you just said the word there's a capacity issue. And I think most of the time that's what it is, right? Like most of the time it's our body was not prepared for what we tried to get it to do. It's really no different than like somebody who's been sitting on the couch and then their buddies call them up and say, hey, do you want to go play some pickup basketball? And they go play like hours of pickup outdoor basketball. And then for a week, their body feels trashed, right? They were unprepared for the activity they tried to do.
Yeah.
And now
so is basketball evil? Nah. It's just you haven't done. I mean, it really is like it is funny that we're having. It's a good conversation, but it's funny that we have to have that conversation, and that physicians and not to bag on, because there's any field there's good ones and bad ones, but there is a prevalent problem with the misinformation being fed to a lot of clients about what will end up helping them, and avoidance typically with most things in life that are important to us is not the answer. Avoid it. Now, as a physical therapist, there's seasons of, I'm sure you have to, I mean, there's seasons of, don't do this thing for a season, but that's the key word, is that it's usually a season. It's usually for a very intentional period of time. Yeah. For whatever reason. But it's not like complete and utter avoidance forever.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, totally. Like an easy example, right? We talk about running a lot is if I suspect that somebody's coming in and they happen to have a stress fracture, I need them to stop running.
Right.
That they need
Right.
them to stop
Stop
running.
running, yeah.
So that we can let that heal. But that doesn't mean we're never gonna run again.
Right.
And if someone comes in, they've recently tweaked their back and we suspect that maybe they have like a really hot disc, right? Like they have a disc injury that is causing symptoms down the leg when they go into a position of flexion. Well, deadlifts might not be the first choice that we're gonna use to rehabilitate with that person. Now, it hopefully will be like a later stage one
Yeah.
that we are doing.
Yeah.
But we're probably not doing that on day 1 or 2
Yeah.
while we work to calm their symptoms down, get them to tolerate some spine movement, work on spinal
Yeah.
stability, and then we do though need to get ourselves back to the position where how do we avoid that happening?
However, you're probably doing things that are in the spirit of the movement, though.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I always talk about the spirit of the movement. You talked about you're talking about the different levers that you can pull in
Mhm.
training to get someone on the spectrum for what
Yeah.
they want. The biggest thing is when someone has pain is oftentimes complete avoidance of the movement is probably the last option down the list. Usually, to your point, there's range of motion, loading, tempo. There's a lot of things that we can do to stay what I call within the spirit of the hinge, the
Mhm.
spirit of the squat, spirit of a press or pull, whatever these basic human
Yeah.
movements are. That you can find if the person's patient enough, instead of seeing it on their workout list and being like, well, I'm bagging this for today because it hurts today. I've always encouraged to, even if it stings the ego a little bit, let's say, I'm just gonna use simple numbers here, but let's say I got a guy who's, he's been squatting 250, right? And he comes in and for whatever reason, because there's a myriad of reasons, you talked about sleep and stress and all these other things that sometimes don't even have anything to do with the workout.
Oh,
But
yeah.
let's say he's been rolling for a while, he comes in, and this happens all the time, Andrew, but just for whatever reason that day, it's not feeling right. What will often happen, and I'm gonna raise my hand, I've been guilty of it too, because we all do, because we get that kind of like, no, this is my number, and
Right.
and I'm doing this,
Yeah.
right? And the human nature is to bag it for that day. It's like, well, I'm just not squatting today. What really should happen is you take the time, it is you drop about 20%. I would tell my people, keep dropping 20% until you find your ability to go through that range of motion again, relatively pain-free.
Hmm.
Now, if you keep dropping all the way, if I got a guy who's squatting 250 and he gets all the way down to body weight and he can't do something, then that's information to us. There's something going,
Right.
like something bad happened.
Yeah.
Something potentially is going on. But the point being is stay in the spirit of the movement and get the workout in that day.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times I've noticed if a person does that, they give their body a chance to still recover, but still get some sort of adaptation, and they'll usually be fine within the next session or so,
Yeah.
unless there's a real problem.
Yeah, like how can we still accomplish what we had planned for that day, even though we have to modify it?
Yeah.
And live to train the next day.
Well, it empowers the client too,
Yeah.
because again, I keep using the word levers with that because that's the way my mind thinks of it. But there's so many of these empowering things that they can pull on
Yeah.
to keep it going. That's my job, and my job and your job is it should be empowerment. I want them to not have to rely on me
Yeah.
to be like, yeah, I want them to know ahead of time, man, there's a lot of things you can try to keep this going. Keep this going.
Yeah, totally. And I guess I'll apologize in advance. I'm gonna butcher or not know the author and the year and whatnot of a couple studies that I wanna just briefly
yeah.
mention, but I'll include these in the show notes. I'll go dig and find them. But a lot of times we have somebody that's in pain and we still have them do a movement that is painful if it's not getting worse, right? Like, and there's this study out there, and again, I forget the year and all
I'm
that.
glad you brought this up. Go ahead. Yeah, this is great.
Where the primary intervention that was used in this study with people with back pain, chronic back pain, that they're rating on a scale of 0 to 10, like they're rating it towards the top, right? Like 8, 9, or 10, like we have significant back pain. Well, the study was basically like, well, what do we got to lose? Let's have them deadlift and let's see what happens to their back pain, because it basically can't get worse. They already said it's
According
like
to them, it's already like
they fill out the pain scale and the disability survey, and it's like it's already negatively impacting their life, basically as bad as it can get. So let's have them deadlift. And I believe what they had them do, the protocol in the study was, I think it was 8 weeks, but it was like they were doing 5 by 5, like heavy deadlifts.
Yeah.
Right? Like they were having them lift as heavy as they could tolerate.
Yeah, and for the audience, too, heavy, because we go over this too, heavy is a relative term. So
For sure.
when Andrew and I are throwing out heavy, that's, don't be scared by that. That's
Mhm.
relative to your ability.
Yeah, yeah, and I believe in the study, they were self-selecting like
Yeah.
what the weight was, right? It wasn't like, oh, it's this poundage. But they had these people deadlift in over the course of the study period, 8 weeks or whatever it was, compared to the control group that was not doing that or was doing usual care, which is the most hilarious term in a lot of these like rehab kind of studies, because usual care is like the bullshit that happens in most medical offices where it's like taking anti-inflammatories or rest, avoiding the things, or doing like such small exercises.
So is that what they
right?
mean in those studies by usual care?
Usual care is like, think of like the bare minimum that you could do, like you go to your physician's office and they, you have back pain and they say, well, we just want you to rest for a week, take this anti-inflammatories, like usual care is like we're not really gonna do anything about it, we're just gonna let time run its course and see what happens.
Symptom, not source.
Yeah.
Sort of thing, kind of like,
And the people that did the strength training, the deadlifts, it wasn't even close. They got such better outcomes in this study. Their weights went up. They filled out these surveys, pain scale and their disability outcome survey. The scores improved on all of them. There were some other studies where they compare like doing deadlifts to a more traditional, I guess is the word that I'll use, traditional form of physical therapy, which is like small banded exercises, some back rotation, some pelvic tilts,
Sure.
bridges, maybe like, like the little body weight
probably
things.
more open chain
Yep.
type stuff, right?
Stuff on the treatment table, no weight, body weight things, few reps. And what they saw in those studies is the people that did the deadlifts and the people that did the more traditional PT both improved similarly in the outcomes that they measured, right? Their pain numbers improved similarly. How they answered the disability survey was similarly. But if you look between the lines of the research study, would you say that a person who's able to do these body weight banded exercises compared to a person who is without pain now deadlifting, relatively heavy weight, are those two people the same, right? Like, do those two people have the same confidence level, belief in what their body is capable of doing? Like, the person who's able to pick the stuff up off the floor, without a doubt, is going to be the one that feels like a more robust, harder to kill human being.
Right.
Even though they both improved according to the paper. Like, so you have to read these research papers with like a grain of salt, because a lot of times the methods or like how they set up these studies, it's so stupid. Like, well, no kidding that, sometimes the outcomes that we get, but it's like a person who's doing trunk rotations on the table compared to the person who's doing deadlifts,
Right.
and now they have the same reduced back pain. Those are not the same two individuals.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so it's, I don't know, it just blows my mind.
No, that's great. It'll be interesting to put that study up.
Yeah, I'll find it.
You'll find that, but you touch on another point, whether intentionally or not, that I think is huge in this topic, is that this is the truth. Not everyone wants to hear this, but the longer you do this, you have to understand that there is a period of suck that you have to go through when you're rehabbing injury. There's most of the time this period of you will still be in pain. And I think some people fall off the wagon because there's this, maybe it's expectation, it's bad expectation that there's not going to be some sucky periods during that it's not going to be linear at all. It's very roller coastery and you're going to have some bad days.
Yeah.
The ability to still, when you're rehabbing from injury, to deal with some pain. I think I use a good rule of thumb is like, and it is subjective, of course, but like if someone's telling me something's like over a 5 out of 10,
Sure.
for that day, I'm gonna find a different thing. But if it's what we call an acceptable level of pain, 5 or below, and everyone's a little bit different on that. But if it's pain, but it's not feeling like it's making it any worse, I'm gonna keep doing it that day, because the real key is, and this is what makes our job a little difficult, is I'm more concerned with what happens about 24 hours later. So 24 hours later, if you are experiencing the same amount of pain or less, we are going to keep going that route. Same, so you may not have gotten better, but if 24 hours later, you're still, at least you haven't gotten worse, you're about the same level or better. So better, obviously, we're gonna keep doing what we're doing. We're good to go. If
Yep.
24 hours later, you did get appreciably worse,
Mhm.
then it's my job to come up with some answers and course correct a little bit and then figure out and then keep rolling over that product. Because the truth is, a lot of this, we have a lot of science, but the human body is so complex. There's a myriad of trial and error with some of this. So where people drop off the wagon is that they hold so tightly to what's happening in the moment.
Right.
And not the long term. And that sounds like what most of life, because we're all like these instant gratification. So I just want to tell anyone who's listening, who's going through that, you're going to have to, what people don't tell you is that there's gonna be a period of what we call the suck. It's gonna, if it's an acceptable level of pain, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean you're not improving, because
Yeah.
you could absolutely be improving. It's just how this process works. From a stimulus and adaptation, stimulus recovery adaptation, that cycle just takes some time.
Yeah.
Especially with tendons, especially with muscles recover quicker, but the connective tissue, the tendons, the joints themselves, as Andrew knows, it has a different cycle to it from its recovery.
Yeah, I was having a similar conversation with a client earlier this week, since we're, midweek having this conversation of, okay, this is how you feel leaving the office right now. I would love you to text me tomorrow and let me know what it feels like tomorrow afternoon, about 24 hours later.
Yeah.
So that I know, is it better, worse, or is it the same?
Yeah.
So that we can go through that decision-making process of like, okay, we challenged it enough. We did too little, we did
Right.
too much, like, what should we do next time to course correct if necessary, or do we continue on our path? But yeah, I think the point that you made about the roller coaster kind of pattern of the rehab is not gonna look like a straight line from where you are today to where you're hopefully going to be
At all.
months or years down the road. There's gonna be a lot of ups and downs along that pathway. And some days are gonna be worse than others, but what we hope, right, as the professionals working with people is we just hope that the trend is upward, right?
trend,
The
yep.
trend needs to hopefully go in an upward direction. And when it's not, then we start asking more questions, making sure, like, do we actually have the right diagnosis, that we're operating under this assumption here? Do we need imaging? Do we whatever?
Mhm.
But like the last thing that I want to do usually when someone comes in the office with back pain is refer them for imaging. I want that to be like a last resort kind of thing, because inevitably what's going to happen is if we put them in the tube, right, in the MRI, there's a good chance that something is going to show up on that image. But there's no way to know if that thing that shows up on the image was there before their back started hurting, if it happened when their back started hurting, if that's even what's driving their symptoms in the first place. And if you take a bunch of asymptomatic, no symptoms people and put them in an MRI tube and we do MRIs of their spine, a lot of those people, like 2/3 of them, are going to have things that sound very scary on the MRI results page show up.
Yeah.
And then some of those people are now going to have back pain just because of what their brain's telling them, like, oh shit, I have a disc bulge.
Yes.
That disc bulge could have been there for a very long time.
Yep.
And you didn't even know about it until you got the MRI.
Just laying there latent and not doing anything to you. That's interesting with pain signs too. That is so true, is that there's pain signs is just I'm very enamored with it, because it's God, there's so many things that affect it.
Yeah, and I mean
that aren't necessarily structural.
totally.
I mean, there's the structural stuff, but there's so much. So many people's probably, it's some of it's the life we lead.
Yeah, totally. Well,
like,
you bring up a good point, because this is true of everything in the body, but in my experience working with clients, I find this to be the most true for spine related issues. I guess we'll say back pain and neck pain primarily, is that our lifestyle drives that a lot.
Yes.
And drives that more than like other peripheral issues, wrist pain, elbow, shoulder, whatever. Like I tend to find spine related issues are more driven by poor sleep, poor nutrition, high stress, like think of a time in your life where you were sleeping really bad, where you were under a lot of stress, like you probably remember that your body felt more achy, sore,
Yeah.
like you didn't feel like doing things. And if we can control inflammation in our body by, you know, sleeping 8 hours a night, trying not to have processed sugar and all this processed food, trying to get a handle on the stress in our work, our family life, our whatever personal life. If we can control that inflammation, we can manage those symptoms quite a lot better without things like pain medication or whatnot. But if we can't, and that inflammatory scenario is very alive and present, well, man, it's going to be really harder to get a handle on that pain because it's not just an orthopedic movement problem. It's all of it. It's all those things.
Yeah, and that you know, from our standpoint, we can only control, you know, especially with what I do, I only control a very, you know, the movement standpoint of it. So yeah, you can make all the suggestions in the world. At the end of the day, a lot of that other stuff comes from, you know, them, the client at home having to change a lot of those things. That makes this job tough sometimes, obviously, is because you're judged on your outcome of getting this person better. However, the truth is, and it's not a cop out, it's just the way it is. There's other factors involved in pain sometimes that are becoming less mysterious, but have always felt mysterious and quite honestly are outside of the practitioner's control.
Yeah, a lot
other than suggesting and making, you know, suggestions that you change those things. A lot of it comes down to the client implementing those things, and it's a good discussion to have because so many people, a lot of pain is it sounds very like psychobabble, but it is emotional. It's a lot of things.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think, you know, where I want to maybe steer this conversation towards, you mentioned this before, it's a lot of times I'll call it misinformation, like you mentioned ignorance and like a lack of understanding around like what a deadlift is, how to do it. It's coming from, quite frankly, a lot of times providers, or people in society hiding behind their computer screens and in their basements typing on their computer, but behind people that are telling you to avoid a thing that they don't do, right? Or that they don't have experience doing. And
or if they got hurt themselves doing it.
Yep.
Which then goes back to the whole fallacy of like, well, you know, is it the thing or is it how you did the thing? You know, so it comes down to a lot of that.
Because quite frankly, again, I don't have the data in front of me, but like weightlifting has a way lower injury percentage, the likelihood of somebody who trains in weightlifting or does sports in weightlifting being injured compared to other sports, soccer, football, basketball,
it's relatively
is way lower.
Relatively
right? It's a way lower risk activity to be doing. And oh, by the way, at least on an elite level, all the people doing those other sports participate in weightlifting to make them better and less risk of injury in those sports. But I guess what I want to ask you from like your training professional experience, like where should people start? Let me lay out a scenario. Say there's somebody listening to this conversation and sticking with us through the half an hour here so far, and they don't have experience deadlifting, or maybe they have irritated their back before picking something up. And I won't say deadlifting because I don't know about you, but I find much less common that people actually hurt their backs deadlifting in the gym setting compared to picking something else up in their day-to-day life, loading the dishwasher, whatever. Like that's where people end up getting hurt more.
Flexion, rotation.
Yeah. But like where should people start? If someone has no experience deadlifting, has hurt their back before, but they're hearing this conversation and they're convinced now, like, man, I probably need to be doing this.
Yeah.
But they're like, but I don't want to get hurt again.
Right.
What should they do?
Well, one of the first things, so this is two things I do believe. So I went back and just said, if I'm doing my job, you know, it is to empower people. That still being said, though, if you really are worried about it, it is helpful to, even if it's for a season, find someone who knows how to execute the movement properly. Now, videos, it's interesting. Videos are a great tool and a great source. And for a section of the population, someone can just watch a video and that's how they learn and they're fine. So definitely, and videos are, you know, a crapshoot as well as it is with anything. You know, you have to do some due diligence with this. I'm not going to lie and say, hey, it's really easy to find good coaching because it's like anything else. You do have to do. You want someone to build your house, maybe do some reference checks and find someone. So I would say one of the first things is that you're serious about it, you need to find someone who knows how to execute the movement properly, because there is some efficacy in doing it in person. For outside of the few people who can just assimilate a video very quickly and then they can get in the perfect position. A lot of people are kinesthetic learners, on top of being visual learners, or they're audio learners, and having someone in real time being able to get you into a good position. Now that sounds self-serving because coaching is what I do, but it just is the truth. A lot of people can watch videos on how to do this, but there's a lot of value in, you know, you can videotape yourself, that works too, but there's a lot of value in having someone there, number one, to teach the proper mechanics. Now, that being said, let's say you find someone to do that. The other, I think, pro tip would be to not get too dogmatic about the implement that you're using. It does not have to be a straight bar. So it can be probably one of the more easily accessible items is a kettlebell for a couple of reasons. The kettlebell is just this central mass of iron sitting right there, so you're not going to mess around with a lot of other of the rotational forces of picking it up. And plus the handles tend to be a little taller to where it does help those who might have some mobility issues in their hamstrings of getting down to, because all straight bars, because 45-pound plates and all the plates are a universal circumference, the bar is always, no matter if you're tall or short, is always the same distance off of the floor. So a kettlebell is usually a little easier to, even if you can't get down to the kettlebell, placing like a couple fives underneath the kettlebell is easy, not only easier to manipulate just off the floor, but if you do have to raise it up, you can just slide a couple fives. It's just easier to set up basically for the beginner to start learning that hinge mechanic, in my opinion. So I would tend to go toward kettlebells, but again, that's not a hard and fast rule too. If you're fairly injury free, you can do the same thing with a barbell, a trap bar that you step into works out as well, works well, because again, the handles tend to be a little taller and allow access for people who may not have good access from a range of motion standpoint.
For sure.
Some of the other tips would be if you're not quite comfortable actually doing a real deadlift, and it's called a deadlift again for a very simple reason. It just simply means it starts from a dead stop off the floor. It's where the name comes from. But the versions or variations like Romanian deadlifts, to where you do not have to start from the bottom position, coming up and then being very strict about it. It's a more of a strict hinge, but Romanian deadlifts are good introductions to people wanting to learn the hinge as well. Typically you're using less load on that anyway if you're worried about it. Same deal though, you can use a kettlebell or whatever, but it's usually a stricter, less heavy option that will allow you to truly stop authentically in the range of motion that you can currently control without feeling like you have to get super low all the way to the ground. And then you can build from there.
Well, and I think the part that you mentioned, again, like not trying to say this in a self-serving kind of mentality, but having some instruction from someone who's very qualified and knows how to do it properly to get you into the right position so that you can start to feel what does that position look and feel like is so beneficial. I actually had a client that was here yesterday, and back to the back to the story about doing more than the tissue capacity that you had, like the way that this particular person injured their back to begin with is doing heavy yard work, moving a very heavy rock, picking it up off the floor, trying to move it from one part of their yard to another, that they had not been lifting anything even close to that amount of weight in quite a long time. So blew their back up, injured their back. It was just like a lot of muscle tightness, but I think in that process there was a disc irritation that happened. So anyways, we're back to doing some kettlebell deadlifts now at about half the weight of what that particular rock was, first of all. And he was demonstrating some of those for me yesterday. And he was like, see, this is bugging my hip. Well, then what we did is we adjusted his starting position. And back to what we said at the beginning, we adjusted it by making sure his shoulders were above his hips, were above his knees at the start, because in his initial demonstration to me yesterday of the deadlift, his shoulders and his hips were virtually on the same plane. His back was like almost parallel with the floor. And then his knees were a bit more open, and he was lifting the weight off the floor a little bit more like with his back, so to speak, as opposed to having the leverage and having the levers aligned in a way that allowed him to push through the floor and drive the weight away from the floor. And when we adjusted his start position, basically by dropping his hips a little, letting his shoulders come up a little, that hip pain he was feeling went away. And then he was able to demonstrate a few reps, no reproduction of that same pain he had like 2 minutes later.
And it should be noted too, with enough training in that new point that doesn't hurt him. You always want to plant in the back of, and everyone will have a limit, but you want to plant in the back of the mind. If you are starting this and say you're frustrated because you don't have a lot of range of motion right now, that comes too over time. There's iterations to this. You don't have to immediately go all the way. Is as you become stronger and the brain releases the brakes, so to speak, and it trusts that the tissues and the muscle can have capacity there, it will open up that capacity to you, even if it's an inch or two here or there. And the other thing, if you don't mind, just real quick, that why we do this is actually for the reason you said. Like, it's for most people, it's for real life. It's for being able to lift a rock. So you have to understand why we do this. Let's say you're someone who doesn't like lifting. That's fine. You don't have to like lifting. It's important though to attach it to something you do like. And if you want to continue working in the yard, you want to continue to pick up your kids or grandkids, you want to continue blah, 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 fill in the blank. You have to understand this whole game is about creating a buffer for you. And the reason like someone like his back would go out or someone's back would go out would be the lack of buffer. And what deadlifting does, because in real life, you would like to set that up as best you could in real life, picking up that rock. But if you've ever picked up a giant size rock, you are not in any way, shape, or form going to be in quotes the ideal deadlift position. Right? You want to still try to set it up. Shoulders above hips, hips above knees. Yes. But there is something called brace flexion that a lot of strong men use when they're doing the Atlas stones. Odd objects are what we call it. So most of real life, you're helping someone move. Most of real life are odd objects. So what we do in training is we do stay strict and adhere to form. Yes. And the more you do that, you do create this buffer for that when you do go, if you do happen to go off script in real life, you have this built-in capacity now to where things can go wrong a little bit. There's a percentage of error that you can now do and not break. But most people, since they don't have any of that foundational strength from resistance training, no buffer at all, very little room for error. And that's what tends to happen when someone's bending over or rotating and stuff like that. It's not that those movements are bad, it's just that, man, you're just, let's call it what it is. You're very weak in that position, and you have very, very, very razor thin margins for error.
I think margins for error or buffer is like a great term to use, because yes, there's many people like myself, like you, we enjoy training, right? But that doesn't mean we always enjoy weightlifting. Like, sometimes we enjoy it because we've started to see some of the benefits that we feel, and now we enjoy it because of the results that have compounded. But like, if you need to attach it to something that you do want to be able to do to motivate you to be able to train, like, that's exactly what we need to do. And picture training as like, this is the thing that I do so that I get to do this other thing
that I really want to do.
play with my grandkids, go for a hike, like whatever, camp and sleep on the ground in a tent and not wake up with debilitating back pain. Like, we're building ourselves resiliency, we're building capacity and tolerance in our body, so that when we do something, and I'm not going to say when we do something that is, like you said, off script or not we will. Like, if I'm going to go home and pick Aiden, our son, up off the floor, it's probably not gonna be the
Yeah.
perfect ideal deadlift
Yeah.
because he's way down on the floor, right?
We gotta make that clear to the audience. Andrew and I aren't, I don't think you do or I do. As much as we do this, every time I bend down to pick something, I am not going through my head of the perfect
No.
deadlift form. I'm just not,
I'm just
because
bending down and picking it up.
life would be weird that way doing that. So we're not like, now if you have back problems, you might have to be more intentional early on. Like
Yeah.
if you're having issues, that you might have to be very intentional for a while with how you
Yep.
bend down and pick something up. But that's the point, is if you do this right, you eventually, you just kind of can bend in unique positions and it doesn't do anything to you.
Yep. Yeah, you're giving your body the leeway essentially to like get away. I don't know if I want to use the term get away, but
Well,
like you put in the work and now you have the ability to get away
earned
with
it.
yeah,
You earned
you've
it.
earned the ability to
You earned it.
move in a way where you don't have to be fearful of it and
Yep.
you're not going to get hurt just by bending over to
Yep.
tie your shoe, for example.
100%.
You don't have to deadlift to tie your shoe.
Right.
You just bend over and
Right.
just tie it.
Yeah.
And
Flexion
move on
spine,
with your day.
spinal flex, you should be able, you should be able to
Yeah.
flex your spine and not have it go
Pop
like
on.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Well, and I think in a way, I know we had like a shortened time period that we
Mhm.
wanted to knock this out in, but sort of laying out that potential progression of like where can somebody start to try to get back to things and why should we train? Like why should we train so that we can be able to do the things that we want to be able to do to live our life the way we want to. I think is a good place to like sort of lead this
Yep.
conversation. I guess what I would encourage you guys to do that are tuning in to listen to this. First of all, if I didn't say that at the beginning, really appreciate you listening to it, sticking through the end of this episode and listening to Shaun and I. But if you have questions, man, I want you to make sure you reach out to us, comment on this, send me an email, and I want to give you, Shaun, an opportunity just to like share. If people have questions, we'll share these too, but like where can somebody get in contact or touch with you to make sure that they can get some questions answered, or if they want to utilize you as the expert to teach them the mechanics of how to get back to deadlifting so they can come in and see you.
Yeah, we'll go easy here. It's just easier. If anyone's listening, locally, you can hit me up at Shaun at cruciblestrength.com. Also too, you can reach out to me on Instagram at crucible_strength. And yeah, just kind of DM me in if you have any questions about that. But we're also, like I said, if you're local and you happen to be here in the Denver area, I'm here at Lions Den a lot, and you can find me here.
Yeah, there's a good chance if you pop in randomly on a weekday, we're gonna be here sometimes on the weekend. But man, really appreciate you guys tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation on deadlifts, back pain, why we should be doing them and not just avoiding them so that we can do all the things that we want to do. And one of our goals here on the code is to get this show out in front of the eyes and ears of more and more and more people. Get more people deadlifting. So if you've not already left a review on this podcast, that would be so extremely valuable, whatever platform, Apple, Spotify, you name it, that you're listening on. If you could scroll to the review section, drop 5 stars on there and help us drive that number up to get the show out to more people, we would really appreciate it. And yeah, man, thanks, Shaun. Whether this was your first episode or you've been here for a lot of them, we hope to catch you guys on another episode of The Code. We'll see you later. Nice work, Shaun.
You too, man. Always fun.